The morning Delia Marsh drove past the old Hendricks grain elevator for the last time before signing the paperwork, she almost didn't stop. She had driven that county road 1,000 times. Past the collapsed fence rows and the soybean fields that turned silver in early light. Past the Lutheran church with its reader board that hadn't changed its message in 4 years, "He sees what you cannot," and past the water tower that still bore the name of a town that had quietly forgotten itself sometime around 1987. She knew every dip in the asphalt, every telephone pole leaning like an old man tired of standing. But that morning she slowed. The elevator stood alone at the edge of a gravel lot, its corrugated metal sides gone the color of a storm cloud. Its wooden office annex sagging slightly at the southeast corner as though something inside it had finally given up holding its breath. A hand-lettered sign on the gate read, "County Surplus Auction. Starting bid, $10. $10. For a building. For the place where her grandfather had weighed 1,000 harvests. For the room where, 40 years ago, a young woman had been told her opinion didn't count." Delia was 44 now. She had a rusted Subaru, a storage unit in Abilene, and $73 in her checking account. She had been thrown out of her mother's house at 22 over something she still couldn't name properly, a disagreement that had grown into a wall that had grown into decades of silence. She turned into the lot. She was the only bidder. The county assessor handed her a single key on a ring shaped like a grain kernel, promotional, probably from some agriculture expo in the 90s, and told her the property came with no warranties, no utilities, and no guarantee the floor would hold her weight in the northeast corner. He said this without apology, the way men in small counties delivered bad news, flatly, efficiently, as though mercy was a luxury they'd run out of. Delia signed the transfer deed on the hood of his truck because there was no table available, and she walked across the gravel lot alone. The elevator complex was 3 buildings, really, the main tower, which was sealed and structurally questionable, a wide receiving shed with a collapsed roof, and the office annex, which was what she'd bought for $10. The annex was perhaps 800 square feet total, a front room with a counter and 2 metal desks, a bathroom the size of a generous closet, a back hallway with 2 doors, one leading to a storage area, and one marked in faded black paint, "Scale Room." She didn't go into the scale room that first day. She stood in the front office and looked at the calendars still pinned to the wall. There were 4 of them, all different years, 1979, 1983, 1991, and 2004, as though whoever had worked here had simply refused to take anything down, had allowed time to accumulate on the walls the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water. There was a coffee mug on the counter. It had a ring stain inside it, a brown circle, like a small eclipse. Someone had left it there meaning to come back. She thought about her mother. Not because of the mug, exactly, but because of the gesture the mug implied, the ordinary confidence that there would be a tomorrow, that you could leave something unfinished and return to it. Delia hadn't had that confidence at 22, when she'd loaded her clothes into a garbage bag while her mother stood in the doorway of their mobile home outside Salina and said nothing. Not a word. Just watched. What Delia had thought, all these years, was that the silence meant indifference. But she was 44 now, and she had learned enough about silence to know that it didn't always mean what it appeared to mean. She set her own bag down on the metal desk. It was solid oak underneath its metal shell. She could tell by the weight of the drawers. Something good built into something industrial. She pulled open the top drawer and found a dried-up pen, a rubber band that crumbled when she touched it, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a receipt, dated June 14, 1981, for 12 bushels of wheat, sold by a woman named E. Marsh. Delia stood very still. Her grandmother's name had been Eleanor Marsh. She had died in 1988, when Delia was 9, and Delia's memories of her were mostly textural, the feel of her house dress, the smell of talcum powder, the particular stillness of a woman who moved through life as though she were always slightly listening for something. She looked at the receipt for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket, and she walked back out to the gravel lot and sat in her car and did not cry, though something in her chest moved the way water moves just before it breaks through. She would go back inside tomorrow. But that night, she drove to the Lutheran church and sat in the parking lot and read the sign again. He sees what you cannot. She thought, or she did. Over the following 2 weeks, Delia cleaned. Not with any particular plan. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with the space. She'd entertained a vague notion of converting it into a small studio. A place to work on the furniture restoration she'd been doing quietly for years, buying broken chairs and tables at estate sales and returning them to something like dignity. But for now, she cleaned because the building needed it, and because she needed something to do with her hands while her mind worked through what she'd found. She started with the front office. She swept 20 years of dust and mouse droppings and dried leaf fragments into piles, collected them in paper grocery bags. She wiped down the counter and the desks with vinegar water. She took the calendars off the walls carefully, rolling them rather than folding them, and set them in a flat box. She didn't throw them away. They felt like documents. The 1979 calendar was from a seed company. The 1983 one was from the county co-op. But the 1991 calendar, that one stopped her. It was homemade. 12 pages, spiral-bound, printed at what had probably been a local print shop. Each month had a different black and white photograph of the elevator, the scale platform in winter, the receiving pit in fall. The office window with morning light coming through at an angle that made the dust motes look like snow. Someone had made these photographs. Someone had cared enough about this place to document it through a full year, season by season, in images that were, and Delia recognized this, having spent years looking at craftsmanship, compositionally thoughtful. Not amateur snapshots. Considered photographs. She flipped to the back cover. In small type, photos by R. Hendricks. Printed for personal use, 1990. R. Hendricks. The family that had owned the elevator. She set the calendar in the flat box with the others. In the bathroom, she found a shelf above the toilet that held a rusted tin of bag balm, a small hand mirror with a cracked frame, and tucked behind these, almost invisible, a child's drawing folded into quarters. A crayon drawing of a building, tall and narrow, a rough approximation of the elevator tower, with the word Grandpa's written in the sky above it in block letters, the apostrophe missing. The S slightly too large. She carried this carefully to her box as well. It was in the storage room that she began to understand she was not simply cleaning a building. She was moving through layers of a life that had happened here, deposited the way a river deposits things, not randomly, but according to current and weight and time. There were ledger books. 11 of them, green cloth-bound, spanning from 1958 to 1989. She pulled one open and found columns of handwritten numbers, weights, prices, moisture percentages, names. Familiar names. Bauer, Koester, Schroeder, and there, recurring across many pages, Marsh, E. Eleanor Marsh. Her grandmother. Coming here to sell wheat, year after year. And next to the weights and prices, in the margin, someone had written small notations. Not numbers. Words. Brief, almost illegible. Good crop for her this year. Said the North Field finally came in. Or, brought the granddaughter. Quiet child. Looked at everything. Delia's hands went still on the page. The quiet child. She would have been 6 or 7 when she'd come here with her grandmother. She had no memory of it, but now, standing in this room that smelled of old paper and grain dust, something shifted, not quite a memory, but the shape of one. The sense of a large, warm hand. The sound of machinery somewhere below the floor. She sat down on a wooden crate and held the ledger and let the morning pass around her. She waited 9 days before she opened it. This was not entirely conscious. She told herself she was working her way through the building methodically, front to back, which was true in its way. But the truth beneath that truth was that the scale room door had begun to carry a weight she was not sure she was prepared to lift. She had discovered enough, in those 9 days, to know that the elevator had been more than a business to whoever had run it. She had found a showbox of correspondence, not business letters, but personal ones, written to a Robert Hendricks from various people over what appeared to be 30 years. She hadn't read them, feeling they were not hers to read. But she'd seen enough in the opening lines to understand that Robert Hendricks had been a man people wrote to when they were struggling, when they needed someone to hear them. The letters had an intimacy to them that seemed disproportionate to what a grain elevator owner would ordinarily warrant. She had also, in the ledger for 1979, found an entry that made no accounting sense, a payment made to E. Marsh not for grain, but labelled simply advance against future harvest, charitable basis. The amount was enough to matter. Enough to, for instance, get a family through a hard winter. Her mother had been born in 1955. She would have been 24 in 1979. Delia did not know the specific contours of her family's financial history in those years. Her mother had never spoken much about it. But she knew the general shape, the foreclosures, the thin years, the particular pride of rural women who turned difficulty into stoicism and stoicism into silence. She stood in front of the scale room door on a Thursday morning with a cup of instant coffee she'd made on the camp stove she'd set up in the corner of the front office. And she put her hand on the knob and held it there for almost 5 minutes. Then she opened it. The scale room was not large, perhaps 12 feet by 15. It held, centered on the floor, the original platform scale, a heavy iron frame with a wooden deck, the kind used to weigh truckloads before the digital systems replaced them. It was painted government green, and it was, she noticed immediately, in extraordinary condition. Not just preserved. Maintained. Someone had oiled it. Recently, or at least within the last decade. The mechanisms were clean, the platform level. Someone had cared for this scale long after there was any commercial reason to do so. But it was the walls that stopped her breathing. The walls of the scale room were lined, floor to ceiling, every available surface not occupied by the scale itself, with shelves. And on the shelves, seeds. Not loose seeds. Packaged seeds. Small envelopes and paper packets and glass jars with handwritten labels, arranged with the care of a library. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. She moved closer and read the labels. Hartley winter wheat, harvested 1963. Tested viable 1971. Red Fife wheat, obtained Mennonite exchange, 1958. Last viable test, 1980. Blue Claridge corn, K.O.Ester Farm, 1967. Treated and dried. Marquis wheat, Marsh family strain, obtained E. Marsh, 1961. The Marsh family strain. She reached out and touched the jar with her grandmother's name on it. The glass was cool. The seeds inside, small, amber, unremarkable to look at, had been sitting in this room for more than 60 years. She stood there in the grain-smelling silence, and she began, slowly, to understand what she was looking at. Robert Hendricks had died in 2006. She found this information in the county records she pulled online that evening, sitting in her car with her phone's data burning slowly. He'd been 81. No children. His wife, Ruth, had preceded him by 4 years. The elevator had passed to a nephew who'd had no interest in farming or the county and had let the county assume the taxes after a few years of non-payment. Hence the surplus auction. Hence the $10 bid. Hence Delia Marsh, sitting in her rusted Subaru on a county road in Kansas, trying to understand what a dead man had been doing in that scale room for 50 years. She drove to the County Historical Society the next morning. It was open Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to 2. Staffed by a single volunteer, a woman in her 70s named Patsy who wore a cardigan the color of sage and who looked at Delia with the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. Bob Hendricks, Patsy said, when Delia described what she'd found. She said it the way you say the name of someone you've missed. You knew him. Everyone knew Bob. Patsy moved to a filing cabinet and began sorting through it with the confidence of a woman who had organized these things herself. He started the seed collection around 1958, 1959, when the big commercial seed companies were really pushing their hybrid varieties, the ones that didn't breed true. He was worried. About what? About what we'd lose. She found a folder and handed it across. He wrote a letter to the extension office about it. They wrote back and told him it wasn't a concern. He kept doing it anyway. Inside the folder were photocopies of correspondence between Robert Hendricks and various agricultural extension officers, land-grant universities, and seed preservation organizations spanning 3 decades. The language in his letters was careful, plain-spoken, persistent. He never argued dramatically. He simply described what he was observing: varieties disappearing from local farms, genetic diversity narrowing with each crop season, and asked what was being done about it. The responses ranged from politely dismissive to simply non-existent. He had kept doing it anyway. He would go to farm sales, Patsy said. When families were selling out, he'd always ask if they had any old seed stock. Most of the time people threw it away. What would you do with seeds from a variety that's been off the market for 20 years? But he'd take it. Clean it, dry it, test it for viability, store it properly. She paused. He never told many people. He wasn't that kind of man. Delia thought about the marginal notes in the ledger. Good crop for her this year. The charitable advance against a hard winter. The maintained scale. Did he know my grandmother? She asked. Eleanor Marsh, Patsy looked at her steadily. "The Marsh strain of Heartland wheat," she said. "Bob always said it was the most cold-tolerant variety he'd found in this county. He got it from Eleanor it must have been 1960, 1961. She'd been growing it from seed her own mother brought over from somewhere in the Dakotas." She folded her hands. "Yes. He knew your grandmother. He thought highly of her." Delia drove back to the elevator in the early afternoon, when the light was flat and honest. She sat in the scale room for a long time, looking at the shelves. Her grandmother had grown something, had carried it forward, had given it, without fanfare, to a man who understood its value. And that man had kept it, in a room that smelled of iron and grain dust, for 60 years. What we lose when we don't know what we are looking at. What survives when someone does. The phone call was the hardest thing she had done in years. Not because of what she expected her mother to say, but because of what she expected to feel, the old compression in her chest, the narrowing of breath. The way her mother's voice had always seemed to occupy her like weather. 31 years of silence, with occasional communications that were formal enough to be nearly meaningless. A Christmas card in years when pride allowed. A second-hand message relayed through a cousin when her father died. Her mother was 72 now. She lived in the same mobile home outside Salina, though Delia knew the land around it had been sold off years ago, piece by piece. The phone rang 4 times. "Hello." Her mother's voice. Different, older, lighter in register, somehow, but unmistakably hers. "Mom." Delia pressed her free hand flat against the wooden deck of the scale. "It's Delia." A pause that lasted long enough to contain everything. "I know," her mother said. Delia had planned to explain about the elevator, about the receipt, about Eleanor's name in the ledger. She had planned to be methodical. Instead, she heard herself say, "Did you know Grandma sold wheat here? At the Hendricks elevator." Another pause. Then, "We sold wheat everywhere in those days. We had to." "Mom." Delia looked at the jar labeled Marsh Family Strain, obtained E. Marsh, 1961. In 1979, someone here gave you an advance. Against a hard winter. It's in the ledger. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Longer. Full. "You bought that place," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "For $10. Good Lord. A breath, almost a laugh. Your grandmother would have found that funny. What happened in 1979? The pause again. But then, your grandfather's equipment loan came due, and the wheat price dropped, and we had maybe 3 weeks before. She stopped. Bob Hendricks called me. Said Eleanor had left a kind of standing credit there. That it was there if we needed it. Another breath. I never knew if that was true. I never asked. Some things you're not supposed to look too hard at. Delia pressed her hand harder against the scale. She left seed here, too. Her wheat strain. He kept it. All of it. The sound her mother made was not quite crying. It was something older and quieter than crying, the sound of understanding arriving after a very long journey. She always said her mother's wheat was worth keeping, her mother said. We thought she was just sentimental. She wasn't. No. A long breath. She wasn't. They stayed on the phone for an hour, not resolving 31 years in any neat way. That was not how such things resolved, and both of them knew it. But they talked about Eleanor, about the mobile home, about a winter in 1979 that Delia's mother had carried alone for 45 years, about what it felt like to receive help so quietly that you could almost convince yourself it had come from nowhere. When they hung up, Delia sat in the scale room until the afternoon light moved across the floor and then away. She was thrown out at 22 over something she still couldn't name properly. But sitting here now, with her grandmother's seeds on a shelf and her mother's voice still warm in her ear, she began to wonder if the thing she'd never been able to name was simply fear. The ordinary terror of a woman who'd been holding too much alone, for too long, who hadn't known how to ask for help and so had made everything impossible instead. How much silence was fear wearing a coat? How much hardness was love with nowhere to go? By the end of the summer, Delia had catalogued every seed in the scale room. She worked with the help of Patsy from the Historical Society, who turned out to have a background in horticulture she'd never mentioned, and a retired agronomist named Walt who drove over from Salina on Tuesdays with a testing kit and a quiet enthusiasm that felt almost sacred. They spread their work across the front office, the ledgers open beside them for cross-reference, the calendars pinned back to the wall. There were 217 distinct varieties represented in the scale room. Of these, 41 were varieties that, according to the regional seed databases Walt knew how to access, had no other documented surviving stock. 41 varieties that existed nowhere else in any repository or collection. They had been sitting in a corrugated metal annex off a county road in Kansas, in glass jars with handwritten paper labels, maintained by a man who died without children and without recognition, who'd received politely dismissive letters from extension officers for 30 years and continued regardless. Walt held up a jar of something called Turkey red wheat, a variety that had arrived with Mennonite settlers in the 1870s and had once covered millions of acres of Kansas before being largely displaced by commercial hybrids, and said, quietly, "Do you understand what this is?" "I'm beginning to," Delia said. They contacted the Seed Savers Exchange. They contacted the Wheat Genetic and Genomic Resources Center in Manhattan, Kansas. They filed documentation with a Heritage Grain Preservation Network. They were careful and methodical and unhurried, because the seeds themselves were unhurried. They had waited 60 years. They could wait a few more months for the proper protocols. Delia's mother came in September. She drove herself, which Delia hadn't expected, arriving in an old Buick with a cracked windshield and a box of canned goods she'd brought because, as she said, straightening her jacket in the gravel lot, "You probably haven't been eating properly." They didn't say much. Delia showed her through the building, the cleaned front office, the calendars, the ledgers with Eleanor's name appearing across 30 years. Her mother ran her finger along a column of entries, and her face did something Delia couldn't quite read and had learned, in the years of her own aging, not to rush. Then she took her to the scale room. Her mother stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves for a long time. "He kept all of it," she finally said. "Every bit." Her mother moved to the shelf with the jar labeled Marsh Family Strain and lifted it with both hands, the way you'd lift something young and fragile. The seeds were small and amber inside the glass. They looked, Delia thought, unremarkable. The way most important things did. "My mother brought this wheat from the Dakotas in 1931, her mother said. She was 19. She told me once that she hid the seeds in her coat when they moved, because she was afraid they'd lose everything and she wanted to have something to start with. Delia stood very still. A 19-year-old woman, in 1931, hiding seeds in her coat, planning ahead for a future she couldn't see, trusting that if she held on to the smallest essential thing, there was a chance. Her mother set the jar back carefully. She touched the label, Eleanor's name, written in a stranger's hand, and she said nothing further, and Delia did not need her to. They ate the canned soup her mother had brought, heated on the camp stove. Sitting on wooden crates in the front office with the September light coming through the windows at the angle the 1991 calendar photographs had captured. They talked about small things. The Buick's windshield. The Lutheran church sign. A cousin getting married in November. It was, Delia realized, the most ordinary afternoon she'd spent with her mother since childhood. Ordinary in the way that something deeply needed is ordinary once it arrives. Not dramatic, not transformative in any visible sense, just quietly, completely real. Before her mother left, she stood in the doorway of the scale room one more time. "What will you do with them?" she asked. "Grow them," Delia said. "Or help someone who can. And keep saving them. That seems like the point." Her mother nodded. "That was always the point," she said, as if she'd known it all along. She stayed through the winter. She hadn't planned to. She'd assumed she would catalog the seeds and transfer the collection and move on, as she always moved on. The way people do when they've never had a place that asked them to stay. But the building held her. Not with sentiment exactly. With something more like recognition. She ran a wood stove in the front office. She refinished the oak desk. She hung a new calendar on the wall, this year's, and found herself marking the days with a naturalness she hadn't felt in a very long time. The 41 unique varieties were formally documented in December. The Wheat Genetic Resources Center sent a research assistant, a young woman with a notebook and careful eyes, who spent 3 days examining the scale room and twice had to step outside for air. Not because of the dust. Because of what she kept finding. She told Delia, "I've read about collections like this in journals. Theoretical collections. Someone saying we need this, we should do this. I've never seen someone just do it. Quietly. For decades. Without anyone watching. Without anyone watching. Delia thought about her grandmother, who had hidden seeds in her coat. About Robert Hendricks, who had written polite, persistent letters into silence and then simply proceeded. About her mother, who had carried a winter's worth of fear for 45 years without ever naming what had helped her through it. About herself, moving through a life she believed was only diminished, thrown out, stripped down, reduced to a storage unit and $73, until a $10 door opened into a room where someone had been, all along, quietly keeping everything that mattered. The scale room smelled like iron and grain and something older. Like preparation. Like trust extended forward in time to someone you couldn't name yet. She sat with that for the rest of winter, and then for the spring. And when the first test planting came in, a small trial plot in a field Patsy's son had offered, 2 rows of turkey red wheat from Robert Hendricks shelves. Seeded into Kansas ground, Delia stood at the edge of it in early May and watched the green come up, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not someone who had been thrown out of a life but someone who had been led, by a long and winding path, to exactly the room she was supposed to enter. The hard thing about love, she thought, is that it often does its most important work before you arrive. And the whole task of a life, maybe, is learning to recognize what was left for you, not in the obvious places, not with your name on it, but waiting quietly, in a room you almost didn't open. In seeds someone hid in their coat, in margins written by a careful hand, quiet child. Looked at everything. Perhaps she had always been looking for this. Perhaps she had simply needed enough time to learn how to see. What does it mean to be kept by someone who never knew your name? And what do we owe the rooms we almost never opened?